Welcome to the Level Up Your Band podcast, episode 49. Hello and welcome back to the Level Up Your Band podcast. My name is Gavin Patterson and I'm here with Julian Pombo.
Hey!
How's it going?
I'm fine. Oh, it's hella awkward when it's made even worse by lag. You know, when you meet somebody and you both say like, "Oh, hello," and "How are you doing?" All at the same time, and "Oh, I'm fine, thank you." It's always good fun.
Yeah. As of recording this is our first podcast recording of the new year. Although this will be out in 3 weeks' time. So
yes,
yeah, Happy New Year again.
Yes, again. It's a Happy New Year for us anyway. Let's hope
New
hope
year,
it's a
new
Happy
podcast.
New Year for everybody.
New year, new me.
This isn't. We're changing the name. It's not Level Up Your Band anymore. It's oh no, what are the other tangents that we go off on?
Level up your
Video
horse.
games.
Level up your cat.
Yes, that's right. Level up your horse. That was a good. Did we talk about horses on the episode?
Yeah,
we were talking about horses.
Yes, it was on the episode.
Yes, right.
Yep.
Horses and cars and.
Yep.
People being like, "Oh, well, you know, the car isn't going to take off anytime soon." So, you know.
Yeah, I was editing that
right.
episode, and I was going, "Why did we go off on this tangent?" But it was fun. Whatever. The horses podcast.
Yeah, man.
So this episode is following on from last episode, which was supposed to be one episode, but the internet demon wouldn't let us do it.
No.
So we're giving it another
was just
bash.
like, you're going to have part one, which is just going to be you talking about mics.
Pretty much, yeah. It's going to be, I think it was a short episode. By the time I cut out the attempt at doing part two, I think it's like 40 minutes. It might even be less. I don't know. So I'm toying with the idea of releasing these two episodes together. I'm gonna see how long the first part is, and then we'll see. But yeah, the last episodes we were talking about kind of microphones and different methods of recording something. But the sort of meat of this little subject is in this part, the mixing part. I was toying with the idea of doing a screen capture and like doing a sort of a practical showing you what the mixing process is, but that could be split over like 10 episodes. So I'm toying with the idea of doing that.
It would only really be useful for the people watching it
on
strictly
YouTube.
on YouTube.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking of, maybe doing like a mini series or something external to the podcast just on YouTube and maybe Facebook. I don't know. If anyone is up for that, we're going to talk about mixing today and it's going to be podcast friendly.
Yes.
But if anyone wants any more in-depth breakdowns of each component, you know, like EQ or compressors or whatever, I can do that, but on a sort of video kind of platform rather than a podcast platform, because it's kind of useless. Me just describing like gear knobs and stuff over audio. Yeah, no, I don't really fancy that.
Also a term of used for a group of. I was going with a joke with this, but I failed because I stumbled too many times. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep it clean, man. Anyway.
Yes.
So we'll fire in with it. So last episode, we ended up describing how to capture audio, how to capture an idea, and put it onto a medium in which you can distribute it. That's the whole point in recording. So you've captured your recording. Everything is all in the box. In the box means you'll hear the term in the box. So I want to try and demystify some of these terms, these jargonous terms. In the box means in the computer.
Right. Because computers are generally box shaped.
Yeah, I suppose so. Basically, it means if you talk about in the box, and with regards to recording or in a mixing studio, in the box simply means the effects or the EQs or the compressors or whatever that you're using. If you're using it in the box, it means you're just using digital effects within the computer. You're not going to external machines and EQ machines and compressors external to the computer. That's all that means. So when someone says, I mix entirely in the box, that means that they just use audio plugins like VSTs. They don't use...
Not that they sit in a cardboard box and do the mixing there.
They might. They might.
I mean, hey, if it works for you, it works for you.
I mix in the box, in a box. I don't know.
Actually, I mix outside the box.
Yeah. So people who mix out of the box and in the box, they do both. So they can have EQ machines and compressors external to their computer, and they can also use internal stuff as well. So there are some famous sound engineers, mixing engineers, mastering engineers who are like quite adamant that you don't need to mix out of the box. And then there's other ones that are like only mix out the box. These tend to be the old school guys from like the 70s and the 80s that have learned on
old school Luddites.
Yeah, well, they've learned on a certain way of doing things, and it was pre-computers, and they're just tried and trusted. People, this was something I discovered about recording and mixing in general. People are like, oh, it's ridiculous. I want to mix on an SSL, 48 channel monstrosity, £500,000 analog console. I'm never going to be able to afford that. I'm never going to get to that level. You don't need to.
No.
Some engineers prefer it because it's more suited to their work style. But if a laptop and a mouse works for you, then great. You can get that people say like, oh, the sound of the Neve desk or the sound of the SSL mixing desk has a certain quality, a certain sound. Yeah, partly true, but a lot of that can be emulated or recreated in the box in the computer without having the big desk.
Yeah, we're quite lucky that living in the first quarter of the 21st century, we've really we're kind of spoiled. The all the analog stuff that is being like emulated by the computer, it sounds like 99.9999% the same.
Yeah,
amps and things like that, and it's all at the literally like a tenth of the price in most cases.
Oh yeah,
especially when you consider buying if you like a Kemper, which is like, how much is a Kemper? Like 10 grand.
It's like,
or is it less than that?
It's £1,800, I think.
80. All right. Okay. So it's not that bad. But £1,800, £1,800.
Yeah.
Compared, when you compare that to buying however many amps you can emulate in a Kemper, which is endless. You can literally have any amp, and they sound just as, if not, just as similar, if not exactly the same.
Yes. Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's
more practical.
We're quite lucky.
Yeah, we're very lucky. Yeah, because digital was really, really bad for a long time.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's like any emerging technology; it's not going to be
perfect.
that good.
No.
It takes time to develop.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the thing. The Telecaster is unchanged since like 1950.
Yeah, they got that pretty right. I mean, the electric guitar in general I would argue, only took 30 or 40 years to get perfected. Because it started out, correct me if I'm wrong, 1920s, 1930s?
Kind of, yeah. Like they were just taking like archtop, like acoustic guitars and putting, like they had developed pickups.
Adolf Rickenbacker.
Because they had microphones and
invented the electric
things
guitar.
like
Am I right?
that. Yeah, there's different. It might have been Rickenbacker technically inventing the first electric guitar, because they invented like an electric lap steel, didn't they?
I don't know.
I think that's what it was, which is technically a guitar. So I think it was Rickenbacker, and then Les Paul kind of took it one step further, and then
Leo Fender.
Leo Fender took it another step further.
By the 1950s,
really cool,
the electric guitar was pretty much perfected, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a really cool YouTube video, actually. I think we mentioned him on the podcast before, but Rob Scallon, he did a video where he went to a museum where they were holding like a Les Paul, because Les Paul was a person. You hear Les Paul and you think just guitar, but Lester Paul was a man who was an incredible guitarist and innovator, and just goes about his process of how he came up with the guitar design, the Les Paul guitar design, and how he was refused by Gibson millions of times. But we won't talk about that just here because we're talking about mixing.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
It is interesting.
So we'll fire right in then. So I'm going to break down the sort of main components that make up mixing.
I'm looking at the 4 different things, and I can kind of guess what they are, some of them, but some of them I'm like...
Yeah. So we'll start with what mixing is. I'll just give a sort of definition of mixing. Mixing is taking the recorded audio that's been tracked. You've got your musicians in the studio, you've recorded your drums, your bass, your guitar, your vocals, everything, and it's now sitting on a hard drive or on tape decks if you work that way. Individually, you've got kick drum, snare drum, individual microphones all sitting at your fingertips on a mixer. So it's taking everything you've already recorded, your drums, your bass, guitar, vocals, blah, 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 and getting a first and foremost, a volume balance. Make sure that the drums are not overpowering the vocals, that you can't even hear them. Making sure all the levels are set to where you want them to be. That's what mixing is.
I have a question.
Okay, go.
This is... I don't know if this is too early to be throwing in this question. But you can always leave it for later if it is. Whenever I've tried to record something, my master fader is constantly like it's constantly like peaking 24/7 all the time, and I'm like, but if I move everything down, everything becomes really quiet, and then I can't hear it anymore. So like, what's going on there?
Is that for later? Is that when you're recording?
So that's before I've even mixed anything. I'm just laying down some parts, and then I'm looking at it, and I'm like, that master fader is constantly peaking.
It doesn't matter.
All the time.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
When you're recording, the only thing you need to care about clipping or not clipping is your input.
Right.
So when you're recording into channel 1 of your interface and it's redlining like crazy, you will hear an audible digital distortion. And you want
I'm all good with that. So
right, that's all you need to care about.
That's fine. So okay, cool.
However,
I suppose we can come back to it later.
That's recording. Mine, like, I don't even look at my master fader when I'm recording. I never look at it.
Right.
It's almost always clipping. It's ridiculous. But because the way digital audio works, it's something called floating point sampling. Basically means that it can't clip. Basically, the headroom is so high that it will never clip internally. It's not until it's complicated. Your face is like, what? Basically, if you were to bring these signals out into the real world, you would create a supermassive black hole and the universe would implode. It's to do with it's advanced maths and crap like that. I can't even begin to explain why it wouldn't work.
That's fine.
So I'm not going to bother. But I'm just going to tell you,
okay.
You don't need to know. Mixing,
I don't need to. Okay, cool.
However,
ignorance is bliss in this case.
The only time you need to care about your output redlining is when you're mixing and mastering. You do not want it to go above into the red when you're mixing and mastering.
Yeah.
Your individual tracks and channels, they can clip.
Right.
But your master cannot.
Interesting.
If you're recording using floating point technology, your headroom of each individual track is like so high on Cubase and Pro Tools and all the rest of it. It's the output that you need to care about. So if I look at some of my mixes I've done, like I've got my snare up full, right? And it's peaking like 12 dB. But my master fader is sitting at minus 1. Something like that, or minus 10 sometimes. So even though the individual faders are like all the way up and redlining, this is true in the digital domain, but not in the analog domain. In the analog domain, every channel can clip, because you get distortion off of the mixing desk that you're operating on, and that's when you need to worry about it.
Right. Okay.
Anyway,
I've just opened. So yeah, no, I've just opened up a tab with 32-bit floating point. So I'm going to read about that.
Okay.
Later. Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's fine. There you go. Because that's the thing that's always bugged me. I was just like, why is that peaking so much? I've not done anything yet.
Yeah.
And
if you're turning the volumes down to get it to not clip and you can't hear it, and you've turned your headphones up full, you need a more powerful headphone amplifier. It's basically the moral of the story. You need more volume on your headphones, because that's why it's clipping. Is because you want to hear it. I learned that. I had a really weak headphone amplifier when I first started, and I always had it up full, and everything was redlining. I was like, I can't hear it. So I bought a more powerful one, and then I was like, I could turn everything down, and it's not redlining anymore, and I can get lots of gain on a headphone amp.
Yeah, I'm just using my interface to listen to stuff. It was just the whole mix, so that's fine, right? So as long as the actual like individual tracks themselves aren't clipping, you don't need to worry about the master fader until later. When I'm recording.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. That's fine.
Yes. So the first thing that mixing is blending all those sounds together, mixing them together so that they sound the most sonically pleasing, if you want that phrase, and then mixing them down, all those tracks, maybe sometimes in some cases 200 tracks in crazy cases, and you're mixing all that together into 2 tracks, stereo left and stereo right, because 99% of people that listen to music in stereo, left and right. Most music is listened to on headphones. You have 2 ears, left and right.
Yeah. Although this is just something that I've noticed anyway. I don't feel that people are. I mean, it's not like the 60s where they were like, stereo, everything hard panned, like it's do you know what I mean? Just like hard pan drums, and then hard pan like bass and whatever. A lot of music nowadays, I feel pop music, I'm mostly thinking about, doesn't really take as much advantage of stereo. It doesn't sound like to me, because I could listen to it with one earphone in and it would sound exactly the same.
There's a reason for that. It's because when this stuff is played on big PA systems or bars, what ends up happening is if you've got hard panning. Now, hard panning means you make a sound come out of only one speaker. So you've got two speakers to distribute all your sounds to. If you hard pan the guitars to the left, it will only come out the left speaker. So if you're in a club or something and you've got a PA, then the people on one side of the club are going to get blasted with guitar, but the other side are going to get nothing. Now, you can appreciate that hard panning in your living room or in headphones. It sounds really cool. The Beatles did it all the time. But it introduces some problems, especially with dance music. You want the bass to be in the center. Reason being, if you hard pan the bass, one side of the club's going to be banging and the other one's going to be dead. So when the beat drops, it's just going to be one side of the room loving it and the other side not.
The other side like, eh?
Yeah. The reason why all that hard panning happened in the 60s is because George Martin and people like that with the Beatles, they spent like no time at all mixing the stereo records. Like Sgt. Pepper, they mixed the whole album in one day. They just didn't care about the stereo. Yeah. They cared about the mono. The mono mix.
It's really funny because like on the really weird like Beatles songs, like you get the song in like one ear, and then I'm pretty sure there's I'm just name dropping YouTubers. Gus Johnson did like a skit about this, and it's like, like, you know, all the nice music in one ear, and then the other ear it's just like all the weird, like bizarre, like sounds, you know, just like a funny trombone and like John Lennon like making some kind of weird like squeal in the background, you know.
So
yeah, it's funny.
The majority of their time was spent on the mono mix. Now back then, most people had mono record players. So mono means you might have two speakers, but both speakers are speaking the same signal. So there is no stereo split where the two speakers are playing independent signals. So mono is just one. That's what it means. So they spent so much time on if you listen to the mono mix of Sgt. Pepper, it's an absolute masterpiece. It sounds nothing like the stereo. It's actually quite rare now. It's hard to get a hold of the mono mix because the stereo one, which they spent no time on, is the one that became the most famous because right after it was released, stereo record players dropped in price and people started buying them, and ended up the mono just got sat in the shelf and everyone was playing the stereo versions. It's just emerging technology and all that. So everything nowadays is in stereo unless the artist chooses for whatever reason to mix in mono. I've only done one mix for someone in mono ever. It's a bizarre way to mix because you don't have to think about the stereo field. You're just piling sounds on top of sounds. You can't use the stereo field to space things out. So your mix has to be really, really good because you need to try and get depth in only one dimension, and it's actually quite challenging. So you use things like EQ and effects and stuff. So we'll crack on. There's only 3 components to mixing, and we can break each component down individually, but we'll start with component 1, and that's equalization, or EQ. You've probably heard of this.
Yes, I've heard of EQ.
Right. So you'll see EQ in your car stereo, you'll see it in your hi-fi, you'll see it on your phone as well. You can get EQ settings on your phone.
Yeah. Games as well.
Yes,
you can EQ some of your games because they'll have different settings for like TV with a sound bar, headphones. It's quite cool.
So EQ, what it is, you've probably seen it, bass, mid, and treble, right? That's usually the one you see. That's called a 3-band EQ because it's got 3 bands, bass, middle, and treble. So what EQ is volume of a particular set of frequencies. So if you turn the treble up, it means you are turning the volume up on the high frequencies. If you are turning up the volume on the mid, if you turn the mid dial up, you are turning up the volume of the mid frequencies. And the frequencies. What's frequencies? Frequencies is vibrations per second. So in music terms, it's pitch. So low frequencies is low pitch, high frequencies is high pitch. So when mixing engineers use a frequency spectrum from basically 50 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz, which is coincidentally, well, not coincidentally, the range of human hearing. So that's the set of frequencies that we care about. If you boost 10 dB, 10 decibels at 40,000 hertz, nobody's going to hear that except your dog, maybe your cat. So we don't care about that as much. So
no, unless you're mixing music for cats.
Yes. So that's basically what EQ is. It's the volume of a particular set of frequencies, and you get different types of EQs or EQ machines or EQ plugins or whatever. So the way I see it, you've got 4 categories. There's probably more, but I mean, there's different ways of viewing these, but this is the 4 types of things you can do with EQ. So number 1, subtractive EQ. It's a pretty simple idea. Subtractive EQ is a process of attenuating, big word, means taking away, volumes, reducing the volume of certain frequencies. So say you've got a violin recording, and there's this horrible, scratchy, piercing, high-pitched thing happens. Now, because you're putting a microphone up to an instrument, it's not a natural thing. A natural thing is to stand in the room with a violin, right? Standing in the room and hearing the violinist play to you. That's the most natural form of a violin, is actually instrument to ear. You can't do that. You want to be able to sell music. If they want to hear the violin, they go to a gig. But you've got to try and capture that. So you put a microphone up, and that's not natural. You have to try and make it sound natural. That's why you mix. So when you put a microphone up to something, it's not going to sound like it's like the violin in real life. You're going to get weird stuff happening. Now, you get all sorts of things with microphones, like proximity effect, which is when you move a microphone closer to the sound source, it gets bassier. And you start to get weird frequency problems, and this is why you use EQ, is to fix these problems. So things that can arise is like really, really bright, harsh stuff happening with things like violin. And say you look at you play a bit of the music, and there's this sharp happening. So what you do with your subtractive EQ, you get your EQ machine, and what you do is you increase the volume, and you sweep up the frequency spectrum until you find where it is most annoying. You go, oh, that's just vile. And then you turn the volume down on that set of frequencies that's really annoying you. And what you've done is you've flattened out the frequency spectrum of the recording and making it sound more rounded, more pleasant to the ear. So that's basically what subtractive EQ is.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah, actually, not gonna lie, that actually does kind of make sense. So if you were listening through it, you would just kind of go through the different frequencies and move them up and down, and then okay, cool. Fair enough.
There's a particular type of EQ machine, if you want to call it that makes this job easier. So what you do is it's like it's got 2 knobs. A volume knob and a frequency knob. So you turn the volume knob up, and then you go onto the frequency knob, and you can sweep it, and it goes, and you can find where the most annoying frequency is, and then dial that in. And you've also got something called Q. Q is, this is actually quite simple if I put it into musicians' terms. So imagine a piano in front of you. A piano is just like an EQ machine. So on the left hand of the piano, you've got the low notes. On the right hand, you've got the high notes, right? Yes.
Gotcha.
So Q is how many frequencies are being turned up around about the one you've selected. So if you have a really narrow Q and you've selected 440 hertz and you've increased it by 12 dB, if it's really, really narrow, then you are boosting 440, but 450 is not being boosted. Now, if you widen the Q, you're boosting 440 and you're also boosting 450, but not quite as much. And then 460, you're boosting but a little bit less. 470, a little bit less, until you get to like 550 and you're not boosting at all. So it's like the equivalent, if you were to play 440 on a keyboard, it's A. If it had a wide Q, you're also playing A, and then on the either side, you've got G and B. You're also pressing them, but maybe not as loud. And then you spread it. The further you go away from it, the quieter they get.
Right.
Does this make sense? Stop me if I'm being weird.
No, I'm following.
The reason why you would want to do this is because if you're being surgical and you're trying to remove annoying frequencies, you want the Q to be quite narrow. Because if it's too wide, you're scooping out frequencies that you don't want scooped out, and then the instrument starts to sound not natural and not musical. So say you've found that there's a frequency and it's exactly 1240 hertz.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to turn down 1140 or whatever I said, slightly below. So you make the Q narrow so that it only affects the certain frequency that you want to affect.
Right.
A picture it on a keyboard. That's the best way I can describe. It's like playing one note would be narrow Q. Putting your hand on the keyboard and going bah is a big wide Q you're affecting. It's
right.
hard to imagine in a podcast. Really sorry if this is making totally no sense at all.
No, actually, because it makes sense to me. I suppose it's making sense to me because I've got a piano right next to me, so I can.
Yeah.
I can see what you're saying.
Yeah. It's
sense.
called Q, but on some plugins it's called width. But at most EQ plugins it's called Q. So that's subtractive EQ. Number 2, additive EQ. So this is when you want to boost frequencies. Right? So, for example, if you've got a snare drum, good example, usually you put a little microphone right next to the drum, like really, really like an inch from the skin, and that's your snare top, you would call it. Usually, me personally, I use a boatload of EQ on snare. I use so much EQ on snare. Just my particular mixing style. I just love making drums sound massive. So I add quite a lot of top end to snare drums to make them crack and really pop out.
Yes.
So when I'm doing additive EQ, I like to have quite a wide Q. So that means if you remember, it's affecting lots of frequencies around where you've selected. So say I want to boost 10 dB of 10K, that's 10,000 hertz. I don't want to just increase 10,000 and nothing else. I want to affect all the frequencies around it. Otherwise, it'll sound horrible.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So that's additive. You typically want a wide Q.
Okay. So I take it if what would end up happening is if you just chose like what was the number 10,000?
Yeah, 10,000.
The other one that you picked, right? So if you just picked 10,000 and you had a narrow Q, it would basically end up sounding tinny.
Very, very. It would only be tinny on one frequency. You would be boosting just one tiny little bit of frequency, where you want to boost lots of frequencies all around
But
about
if you
10,000.
basically, if you had a wider queue and you boosted that entire sort of that kind of generalized area,
Yes.
it would just sound a bit. You'd get more of that crack, but it would just sound rounder.
Yes, and more musical, more
cool.
realistic.
Gotcha.
Because it's boosting the frequencies around about where you've selected. It's less harsh. It's less because you don't get that in real life. When you in real life, say in the context of an orchestra, right? Because that's the closest thing we have to a real life EQ machine. You've got everything from timpani all the way up to piccolo, all the frequency ranges, right? Yeah. You don't get a massive increase in one frequency because each instrument has a range of frequencies. And a bass guitar, an acoustic guitar, every single instrument, even a piccolo, has bass, middle, and treble. A snare drum has bass, middle, and treble. A bass guitar has bass, middle, and treble. It doesn't just have bass.
Yeah.
Because you've got fret noise and string noise and all that, and that's all high frequencies.
That's right. Well, yeah. I know a little bit about EQing bass. It's just literally everything else. But like, I always cringe every time I've seen a bass amp, and it's like, oh, boost the bass is boosted, and the middle is like doing God knows what, and then the treble is like cut off. I'm like, it's not that's not how a good bass sounds. Actually, you've probably seen you've seen it. Like, I have my bass rolled off a little bit mids at 12 o'clock, and then I've actually boosted my trebles because then it gives me that string noise, that attack, and the bass guitar ends up cutting through. You can actually hear it.
Yes.
You know,
that's
rather than sort of like
there's a reason for that,
getting lost in the background.
It's because there's the way human beings listen to music. It's a brain process, and when you take all of the top end off of a bass guitar, all the high frequencies, and you're only left with a bass, it can be just as loud, but when you pair it up with a drum kit and the rest of the band, you cannot distinguish it in the mix from anything else. You can just feel the bass, but you're like, I can't hear the bass playing. So what you do is you boost the top end, and then your brain notices the top end, and then it suddenly links it to the bottom end, and suddenly you can hear the bass.
Yes, and it puts everything together.
Yeah, it's a brain trick. It's mixing engineers have been doing that for years. It's playing tricks on the listener. So you can turn certain frequencies off, and then you lose connection to a totally separate frequency because you're losing that language between the top and the bottom frequency of an instrument. So you can really mess with people by manipulating different ends of the frequency spectrum. EQ is fun. It's a really good tool. So this kind of moves into the third one. So I've written down here colored EQ. So what this means is you get hundreds and hundreds of different types of EQs and different manufacturers and different plugins and VSTs and all this. Some of them are really digital and surgical and just do the basic turn a frequency down or turn a frequency up. And that's fine. But you get some that add color. And what I mean by color is harmonics and distortion. So if you're boosting a snare drum with a digital EQ, it's going to boost all the frequencies that are there. It's just going to boost the volume. That's fine. But if you use an analog representation in digital, so like a VST, like a model, what happens is when you pass the signal through and you boost the frequency that you want, you get harmonic distortion. And that adds more frequencies to the mix. And you get character and tone, and it sounds more musical and rounded. So it's not going to sound as bright. It's not going to sound as harsh if you use a colored EQ like say a Neve 1073 EQ. So the Neve 1073 is a real life compressor EQ that was in the Neve mixing desk, mixing console, the analog mixing console. And the cool thing about it was when you boost those frequencies, you're not just boosting those frequencies, but you're creating a sort of harmonic sonic palette along with it. So it affects the sound that you're boosting and rounds off the frequencies and shapes it and makes it more fluffy. Like that's basically what it means. So you can get really unique sounds. For example, I can have 2 EQ machines on one snare, so I can turn one of them off and turn the first one up to 10 on a certain frequency, and it will sound a certain way. I can switch that one off and try another one, a separate one, and boost it up to 10 at the same frequency. And the two will sound totally different, even though they're doing the same thing fundamentally. But one will color it different. It's like different instruments. It's like different colors. It's like different ingredients when you're cooking. It's just different flavors. And some work better than others at different jobs.
Okay.
That's kind of what colored EQ is. It gives the mix warmth and depth and color, rather than just using your digital up and down and whatever. So does that make sense?
Yeah. The one thing that I'm kind of thinking to is that for me, for example, when I was learning about EQing my bass amp,
yes,
I kind of went off like when I was reading about it, everybody was kind of going for like, oh, well, here are some standard things that you can do. And if you want to find your own sound, start at 12 o'clock and then do your own thing. Yeah. Is there like a general like recommend or like a general guide for these kinds of EQs? So, for example, say you're mixing a bass guitar, or a snare or whatever. Would you be able to look up like optimal like? Basically, do you see what I'm kind of saying?
You're talking about like presets. Is there like a preset thing that just always works, kind of thing? A general principle to think.
Or like a preset that you can kind of work off from, kind of thing. Kind of like in the same way that if we're going to the food analogy, you can get loads of different recipes for lasagna.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But really, it's just lasagna, and there is one kind of core recipe that everybody else has just kind of tweaked.
Yes.
That's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Is there like a core like?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
It depends.
Right.
It depends. So, generally, I would say get your sound the way you want it before you mix it. So when I mix a bass guitar, for example, I do very, very little to the EQ of that guitar. Same with electric guitars. What I for guitars in particular, and bass especially, all I'm doing is I'm trying to shape it to fit and play nicely with the drum kit. And the same goes for guitar. When I EQ guitars, I'm making sure that they fit together like a jigsaw with the bass and the drums, so that there's no clashing frequencies and distortions between instruments. Because if you've got a bass guitar that's plucking away and it's got a really, really loud boom at 100 hertz, and the kick drum is also booming at 100 hertz, and those two together are just being... One of them needs to go, or they both need to be focused down so that they can play nice together. That's why I use EQ for guitars in mixing context. So if you're boosting like ridiculous amounts on guitars, like 10 plus 10 on 8,000 hertz and things like that, maybe you should go back and re-record your guitars. If it's not bright enough, brighten it up at the amp rather than at the EQ stage. That's what I would say about that. And generally speaking, leave. You should tend to leave mid frequencies alone, unless absolutely necessary. The reason being is because humans hear mid frequencies louder than any other. We hear mid frequencies louder than we do low and high. The reason being is because the human voice is mid frequencies. So we are evolved to pick up mid frequencies better, because that's the range of frequencies that we should care about the most, because it's the most it's the frequency that's going to be replicated in predators and human speech and dialogue and other people. That's the one you want to hear the loudest. But if you start messing around with those frequencies, it starts to sound fake. So if you boost the bass on a vocal, it'll sound boomy and not kind of weird. But if you take the middle away, it just sounds alien and weird.
That's a good. Sorry, a bit of a tangent.
Yes,
but I'm sure this is what the people tune in for. Is the crazy Pombo tangent?
Go for it.
That would make a fun sci-fi alien monster, one that like it moves around and like masks everything around, like basically scoops all the mids. So we can't hear it. I don't know. I just thought it would be kind of funny. I don't know how it would work or how it would do it, but like everything it touches is just like, so humans just have a really hard time. It's basically like the Predator, but instead of being invisible, it's just really hard to hear.
Yeah, that's quite cool. That would make a cool horror movie. I think that's kind of been done. That film called
has it?
Quiet? Is it Quiet Place? Where if you
Quiet.
If you make noise,
that's kind of different,
the alien comes after you or something.
Yeah, it's if you make any noise, but
Right.
I'm saying flip that the other way around. It's completely silent,
Right.
because it does all this like crazy manipulation of like EQ in the atmosphere.
That would be cool.
So you can't hear it.
Yeah. So, that's kind of a colored EQ. It's
Okay.
It's the equivalent of running your electric guitar through different types of amplifiers. They all sound different.
Right.
All EQ machines sound different, and they add character to different things. There are some EQ machines that I use on snare, and that same EQ I wouldn't use on vocals. I'm just using an example because it just wouldn't sound right to me. It's just my preferred taste. Anyway, fourth part of EQ is dynamic EQ. Now, what that is, this is really handy. So when I was talking about subtractive EQ, so at a particular point in the song, the bass in the bridge, it's usually in the bridge because that's the only part of the song that's different. The bass is playing a thing that's different from any other point in the song, and there's a frequency in there that's too honky, and I want to pull it out using subtractive EQ. But when he's playing the chorus, now the sound of the bass is weird because I've pulled this frequency out because it's, at the bridge. You don't want it to be pulled out all the time. Maybe there's a point in the bridge where it happens really, really heavily, and then other times it's not. You want that EQ to pull in and pull out when it needs to. So here comes the big popping frequency, right? And then the machine pulls it out. So that's what a dynamic EQ is it only pulls out the bad frequency when it gets really bad. So it's dynamic.
Right.
It responds to crazy frequencies by itself.
Okay, cool. That's all right. So, I saw dynamic and I was just like, that's got to be volume in it. And I was like, no.
No, dynamic in the sense
Totally
of it thinks on its feet. It dynamically adjusts the EQ automatically based on a threshold that you set. So you say, if this frequency gets above 5 dB minus, you should tell it to turn the gain down by minus 5 dB. So as soon as it hits that threshold, it gets scooped out by the machine, and you don't have to touch it. And what ends up happening is it flattens out the frequency spectrum but it does it only when it needs to. So they're quite handy. I use them all the time for some instruments that can be kind of troublesome. Anyway, that's kind of EQ sorted. If anyone's confused, just send us a message and say you've got a project or something you're like really confused about something. Just let me know. Happy to answer questions if online guides are not helping you. So number 2 part of mixing, compressors. So a compressor it's a machine that deals with dynamics. So it controls the sound dynamic range. So whereas EQ deals with the pitch, the volume pitch,
right?
This controls the loudness, the quietness of a signal, the dynamic range. So I'm trying to think of an example of dynamic range. You're playing a piano. A piano has quite a large dynamic range. Good example. So if you play really, really softly on a piano, and then you play really, really loudly, that's a dynamic range. But an organ, a pipe organ, like a church organ, doesn't, like one note in particular, there is no dynamic range. It's either on or off. As soon as you press a key on a pipe organ, it's either or nothing. There is no meh, unless you open up the stops and
the different stops and stuff. Yeah.
So that's how they get dynamics. So they've thought about that. We don't have any dynamics with this instrument, so we'll just add more pipes on to make it louder or quieter.
Yeah. Which is what they used to do, like back in this is classical music stuff.
Yeah.
But like back in the day, they didn't actually write in dynamics in music until the 18th century. I want to say like mid to late 18th century. So it was literally just all. It was just like, oh, we'll just add more violins here.
Yeah.
Just more instruments, and then if we want it to be quiet, we'll have less instruments playing. So you'll notice that if you listen to any Baroque music.
Well, yeah, the harpsichord.
You should.
Harpsichord has absolutely no dynamics at all. It plucks
it's literally just the one sound.
Yeah,
it's just bang,
bang. Whereas a piano has.
If you've ever played, playing harpsichord is interesting. It's the weirdest thing because there's that resistance before the pluck. It's weird.
I've never played one. I'd love to have a shot at one.
Yeah. I went to a fancy conservatoire, so there was just loads of them sitting about. They're beautiful. Like, they're really cool. Another weird tangent. I'll keep this one short. But they're like decorated. So, on a grand piano, how you have the lid?
Yes.
Sometimes, depends on how fancy the harpsichord is, but a lot of the times they have like scenes like just painted in, because you have to remember that harpsichords and clavichords and things like that were, as well as instruments, it was furniture in a room, so you might as well make it look really nice as well. Whether it was just plain or you can get some really some ones that are just like painted with lots of like little scenes of like, I don't know, like animals and like people just frolicking in a field somewhere,
Julian Pombo frolicking in a field.
Yeah. That's the one thing I would get done if I was a millionaire.
Well, you would frolic
get somebody
in a field
to build me a harpsichord.
Okay.
And it's just the Windows XP background, and there's just me naked frolicking.
No, thanks.
Be good fun.
So from frolicking in fields to compressors. So why would you want to use a compressor? So a compressor. There's that old fun. Like, what does a compressor mean? A compressor compresses. Bravo.
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. Yeah. Done. Like, we'll move on to the next one. No.
Yeah.
So a compressor controls the dynamic range of the sound. So,
right.
even though some instruments, like an organ or a harpsichord, has no dynamics, it actually does. Hear me out. So if you hit a snare drum, bah! There's components to that. So you've got your attack. So that's when you snap the snare drum, and it's the very first moment of sound. That's your attack. And then you've got your release or your sustain. So after you've hit the thing, the drum head vibrates for a given amount of time, depending on the drum and the materials and the shell and all that. And it will sit and vibrate until it comes to rest again. So you've got a tail. It doesn't just go beep, it goes bah. And it's got a little breath after it. A compressor can increase the volume of the tail past the point of what it would be naturally. And what it does is it gives it character. So if you compress really heavily a snare drum, it can go bah, because that tail, the quieter that tail gets, the compressor will turn up the gain to overcompensate, and it'll go bah for longer.
Right. I guess if you want, it's quite good if you want to get really experimental with
sounds, yeah,
a lot of sounds and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what they did in the 80s with this is they discovered that what they could do is they could feed a snare drum into a reverb machine, and then compress it so it would go, and then put it through a gate. Now, a gate, we've talked about gates in the past. A gate is a machine that only allows a certain volume to come through it. Anything under this threshold of volume, it shuts the gate and shuts the sound off. So you've heard of gated reverb snare drums, which is like the sound of the 80s.
Yes.
So you would have this snare drum going, gah! But the tail was too long. So you would put a gate on, so when it started to drop down in volume, the gate would shut and the sound would stop. So you would get gah, 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 which is the sound of every snare drum in the 80s.
And that's basically, thinking Take On Me by A-ha.
Yeah.
That's like a classic example of like, ka, ka, just like, you know.
It's really, really such an intense sound. So the compressor, it has a few components on it, things that it can do. So when the sound comes through it, you can adjust certain parameters on the compressor. The typical parameters you see is your attack, your release, your threshold, and your ratio. We'll start with attack. So attack is how quick the compressor reacts to the transient. A transient is the very, very first moment the sound begins to happen. So it's the moment the stick hits the snare drum head. And it's the moment that it starts. So attack, in a compressor's perspective, is how quickly the compressor starts to work. And you can adjust it to be really, really fast. So as soon as the transient happens, as soon as the stick hits the snare drum, the compressor is compressing. Or you can make it late, and it can let the transient through and then start compressing afterwards. So what that sounds like is you'll have a real precise da, and then it'll compress the rest of the signal just the same. But if you have a fast attack, what it does is it rounds off the transient and makes it sound less abrupt, and it'll go va rather than da.
Right.
So that's really simplified.
Right.
Sounds cool on pianos if you have a really fast attack, because it sounds really. There's no transient. It's not staccato-y. It's more like rather than da 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 da. So that's
interesting.
That's kind of what it does. And then you've got release. Release is how long the compressor remains engaged. So like I said, if you've got a tail on your snare drum, so you hit the snare drum, ba, it'll go ba, because snare drums ring. They're ringy. They're made of wood. And the skin will vibrate for a few seconds after you've hit it.
Yeah.
So the compressor, if you've got a long release time, the compressor will keep increasing the volume until the drum stops vibrating. So it artificially boosts the volume for longer after the signal, after you've hit the drum. So if you have a long release, it'll do this for a long period of time. If you have a short release, the compressor will disengage faster. And that creates loads of different types of sounds. There's loads of, you can experiment yourself. If you've got a DAW and you've got a wee compressor with an attack and release, you can just mess about with it, see what it sounds like, try and learn what that sounds like, and you'll know for yourself. So the last two is threshold. So that's your threshold is it's a thing that you'll see in lots of plugins. That's the point at which the compressor or the gate or whatever you're using starts to detect the signal. I was talking about it earlier on the dynamic EQ. It's the point at which the machine starts to work. You can set, in the context of a compressor, you can set if this signal gets to this much volume, the compressor should start working. Anything under that, and it doesn't work. So that's essentially what a threshold is, the point of detection. And then the last one you've got is ratio, and that's how much are you compressing. So you can get different severities of compression, and you usually see that written as a ratio. So you'll have 2 to 1, which is you'll have a little colon. If anyone did maths at school, ratios are like you split a number between a colon. So you've got 2 to 1, 4 to 1, 6 to 1, 8 to 1, 10 to 1, all the way up to limiting, brick wall limiting, which is the highest you can get your ratio. But we'll come on to that later. So that's how much you're compressing. I'm not going to go any further on this because it's starting to get into complex territory. If anyone has any questions, let me know.
Yes.
You can. Is there anything that you are unsure of as we're going through this? Because it's good to clear up things if I'm going off.
I mean, at the moment, I'm kind of following what you're saying pretty well. In fact, you've demystified a lot of stuff.
Okay.
Because I've tried to do it myself, and I've just seen like a compression plugin, and I'm like attack, release, threat. I've no idea.
Yeah.
Got no clue. And now I'm like, oh, okay,
good.
This makes sense.
I'll add one little extra bit. So these settings, so you get your attack, your release, your threshold, your ratio. Some compressors have those options. Some don't. Some don't have an option for ratio. They just have an input and an output attack and release. What that means is the ratio is most likely fixed. You can't change it. Basically, this compressor only has one sound, and the only thing you can adjust is the input of the signal into the machine. But it's still got a ratio and a threshold. You can adjust the threshold by altering how much signal you feed it. But it's essentially the same thing, but you might have less control over how it sounds because, sometimes you need limitations in life because you want certain sounds or whatever.
Yeah.
You get different types of compressors like FET compressors and optical compressors, voltage compressor, so VCA. So the compressor, a VCA, like for example, a VCA compressor doesn't compress by detecting sound. It does it by detecting voltage. And an optical compressor doesn't compress by detecting audio. It does it by detecting light. So inside the machine, inside the optical compressor, the sound signal, which is obviously an electrical signal, there's a little light bulb inside the compressor, and it goes on bright or dim,
Right.
and then there's a little light detector inside it that detects how much light is coming off the light bulb, and then that is the parameter it uses to detect detect how much compression is needed. So it's kind of like organs.
Okay.
You know how you have pipe organs? They use pipes. You have drawbars or tone wheels. So it's a little wheel that spins, and then a pickup that picks up the magnetic interference. You have different ways of doing the thing, but it's different methods, complex stuff. But it's you could go down a rabbit hole. I'm just going to move on because it's just starts to get silly. So the third component of mixing that you need to care about is effects. So that's things you add on.
I understand this bit.
You understand this bit, yes. This is the bit everyone knows, right?
I get this.
Effects is things that you can add to your sound. So EQ and compression, what it does is it edits the sound you've already got. Effects add stuff onto it. So there's three categories: reverb, delay, and modulation. Reverb, everyone knows what reverb is, but it's hard to put into words. Reverb is just acoustic reflections of a space. So it's the sound of a room, the sound of a space. Like if you're in a big church and you shout, it's like, hello. Or if you're in a bathroom, it's like, hello, really short. It keeps, vibrating for ages. A delay is just the original signal or sound repeated. So people will say echo. An echo is a delay, but we don't say echo in sound engineering sphere. We say delay. So when someone asks me, "Oh, can you turn the guitar echo down?" That means delay. You don't say echo. Echo is something you do in a cave. You go echo, echo, echo. But otherwise, you don't use that in musical terms. It's called delay. It's as simple as you feed it a thing like da-da-do, and it will just go da-da-do, da-da-do, da-da-do. It'll just play the thing you played back to you over and over, and you can. Everyone knows that who's a guitarist. The delay pedal, it just plays the thing back to you.
There's excellent use of delay in Man-Eater by Hall & Oates on the saxophone solo. It's got it set up so the saxophonist will play a bit and then it repeats it one bar later. So it's like ba 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 da da ba ba da 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 da. You can tell I've listened to that song a lot because I've got the whole thing memorized in my head.
It's great.
It can be quite fun to play about with delay.
Yeah, delay's cool. I don't know if I need to mention much more about it because everybody kind of knows what it is. Modulation is broken up into lots of different things. So chorus, flange, phase, even like pan or wah. That's a type of modulation.
All right.
Wah. If all that stuff with the wah pedal, guitarists know what it is. You know what that is? It's just EQ.
Oh, right.
It's EQ. So,
but just going really fast.
What it's doing when you move the pedal, you're moving the frequency knob. That's all that is, and you've got a narrow Q, or a narrowish Q, and what you're doing is you're sweeping the frequency spectrum of your guitar signal, and it's going. So you're just adjusting the frequency of your Q up and down the frequency spectrum, and you can adjust your crybaby to be different severities. You can make it really, really loud, so it increases the EQ curve is increasing more gain or less gain, so you can have it more severe or less severe. So it's just an EQ.
And if you're if you're really lazy and you can't be bothered doing that, and you're a bass player, you can get yourself an envelope filter, which kind of does
It's the kind of same
more or
thing.
less the same thing. Yeah, except it automates it for you.
Yeah, an auto wah. So modulation, that's chorus, flange, phase is the typical three. So chorus, flange, and phase are actually tape effects that were discovered kind of like in the 50s and 60s. So it's like passing two tapes of the same recording and playing them back together, but slightly out of phase. So you can do some weird sounds. You can do it with just the touch of a button now with VSTs and guitar pedals and stuff, and it creates a cool sound.
Yes, you can even get guitars now which puts the pickups out of phase as well. You can just flick a switch and then bloop.
Yep. So that's modulation. Pretty straightforward. So we'll move on to the last section. We're almost done. Promise. I want to fire through this because there's no point in doing mastering in one episode because it'll take 10 minutes. So
yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
Okay. So part 3, mastering. This is the next thing. So you've done your mixing, you've done your EQ, you've done your compression, you've done your volume leveling as well. Obviously, volume is a thing. Volume of each instrument. Obviously, you don't want the vocals to be lost in the mix, so you turn the volume up. That's a given. And effects, so reverb, delay, modulation. So you've done all that. So you've mixed all your tracks down to your stereo, left and right. So you now have to master it. So that's mastering is taking the mix and formatting it for distribution.
Okay.
So there's a few things that you do in mastering.
Yes, this is like mastering is like some kind of I just don't get it at all. So
right,
I have no idea. Like when people go, yeah, I'll mix and master it. I'm like, cool. Mixing, I kind of understand. Mastering, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you like sit on top of a mountain and like teach it the secret ways? I don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
All right.
My iPad is just frozen, which is great. So you can't see me. But who cares? It's a podcast. So
yeah, exactly.
So there's a couple of things I've got written down here. So the sort of main thing that happens during the mastering process is limiting. So I talked about limiting a little bit. So limiting, what it does is it stops sound from exceeding a digital ceiling. What that means is it pushes the dynamics of the sound, the song, up to a set level. Now, in digital recording, digital mixing, you don't want your music to go above 0 decibels. Now, you're thinking like 0 decibels. If it's 0 decibels, then you can't hear it. No. It's not how it works in the digital realm. I'm not going to go into that because it's sciencey and irrelevant. So with regards to limiting is just a form of compression. So basically, a limiter has the ratio. Remember, we talked about ratio. It has it up full. So it's limiting. So it's the maximum amount of compression. So what this does, and I'll start by the reason why we have limiters. The reason why we have limiters is because back in the day when music was starting to become more widely distributed and mainstream, it was being played on the wireless or the radio.
Right.
And radio stations, one of the first things they noticed was when they had their spoken audio, their programs or their music, when they played it over the wireless into people's cars, the dynamic range of the sound was far too great. So you had really, really quiet sounds and really, really loud sounds. And this was a problem because 9 times out of 10, when you're listening to your car stereo, you're driving. And cars are noisy, rattly things, especially back in the 19 canteens. you couldn't hear the radio. So you would turn it up really loud, and then a loud song would come on, it would blow your head off. So what radio stations did is they started using machines called limiters, which limited the dynamic range of a sound. It's a compressor, but it's a really, really hard compressor. So the quiet sounds and the loud sounds are actually roughly the same volume. So that's what a limiter does. The reason why you use it in mastering is because the dynamic range of your mix is quite. It can be quite wide. It can be quite great. And for this same reason, when you're playing your music on loads of different formats, so you've got laptops, headphones, hi-fis, car stereos, PS4 controllers, you want it to sound decent on everything. And if your dynamic range is too great, you run the risk of some of the sound not coming across or being lost on certain formats. So what it does is it reduces the dynamic range and increases the perceived loudness of the signal. We call that RMS.
Right.
I can't remember what it's. Random means squared or something. I can't remember. I could be wrong. RMS. What it is the perceived loudness of a signal. You want to get that up to a point, so that your song can sit beside another song and sound roughly the same volume. You'll find if you've ever done mixes yourself, I don't know if you've noticed this, Julian, when you mix your own song, it never sounds as loud as something you can play on Spotify or just a professionally mastered song. It's because they're using limiting and they've brought the perceived volume of the track up higher. And that's what you need to do. You need to get so that when radio stations play your music, all the music sounds the same volume, and you don't have to constantly turn your volume up and down in your car. It's kind of like that. So that's the first part of mastering. Now you can use compressing and EQ and all that in mastering as well, because the mastering engineer might go, the bass of this mix is so high, I need to take that down. Or the treble's like so weak, I need to turn that up. Or there's a particular part in the song where it really pops out here and it's horrible and let me get rid of that and blah, blah, blah. So you can use EQ in mastering as well, just to sort the whole thing as a whole and tweak wee bits here and there. So the sort of final part of mastering, like I said, is to format it for distribution. So you've got to make sure that it works on multiple different formats. So mastering engineers will quite often have loads and loads and loads of different ways of listening to music. So they'll have their really, really, really expensive studio monitors for hearing the sort of the fine-grained detail. They'll also have a boombox, a laptop with speakers on it, computer monitor speakers, iPods, headphones, expensive headphones, you name it. And they need to listen to it on every single format of the car as well. And make sure that the mix sounds decent on everything. You don't want it to sound absolutely unbelievable, crystal clear quality on one and absolute dog garbage on the other. You want it to sound good for everyone, because there are so many different ways of listening to music, and so many people listen to music in so many different ways. You've got a set of headphones by a company. I've got a set of headphones by another company. We have to listen to the same music, and it needs to sound good on both. That's what mastering does. It's a really difficult job, trying to balance everything out. It's really, really hard.
There's some... what do you think of services like... I want to say it... I can't remember what it's... I think it's called Lander.
Yeah. Lander, you're right.
It's like... you literally
it's
just...
an algorithm.
Drop your file in there.
Yeah.
And it just masters it automatically.
Yes, it's an algorithm that has learned how to master music based on like I said, an algorithm that has learned how people listen to music and how music works across different formats. It's okay. it's not as good as a really good mastering engineer, and I don't know if it ever will be, because humans are best at
determining what humans like.
Yes, because it's never the same twice. You can have you don't just pull up a mix and then just bring up the presets for the last song you mastered, because it's going to be totally different. And where on the last mix that you mastered, you might have wanted it to have bass emphasis, but on this record you don't. Say you're mixing a hip hop record, you want it to be quite bass heavy and quite beat heavy and really driven and warm. But on a jazz record, you want it to be soft, gentle. You want a higher dynamic range because you want to hear the actual proper dynamic range of the instruments. Whereas a metal record, the dynamic range is zilch, nothing. Every instrument is the same volume almost. That's why it's so hard to mix, because every instrument is so damn loud. But on a jazz record, you've got so much dynamic range, or an orchestral record, it's so much dynamic range. It's different for what you're doing. And I just don't know if an algorithm can deal with that amount of variability. Although, I could be wrong, and over the next 10 years, we'll see what happens with that.
I suppose it depends on... It depends on what you're using it for. Because I guess if you're mastering, I don't know, like
a podcast or demos to an extent. You know, and you just want like a really quick, like, boom, done,
boom, done kind of a thing to send an idea to somebody. It's kind of there. And I think I don't know whether it's going to replace actual human beings, you know.
I don't know.
But I can see the value in it for doing that kind of a thing, you know, like just getting some really quick masters done. I don't think anybody, I could be wrong, there's probably one guy who's like, I only master my tracks using Lander. There's nothing else. I don't use humans anymore. But that seems... Yeah. So, cool. Okay. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I definitely feel far more equipped. I don't feel as scared of mixing anymore. Of mixing and recording. I feel like I could probably have a good crack at it. Just because there's so many... It's just words. And things that you're just like...
No, you don't know what the words mean. I might do a mixing jargon explanation thing. So like all the words and what they mean in English. I might do that and put it up on the website. I should, just to wrap that up, the mastering is the final part of the mastering engineer sends it to the artist or the manager, and then that goes to Spotify. So the mastering engineer will export all the final formats. So you've got your WAV files for Spotify and iTunes or Apple Music, your MP3s with encoded information on your track details and all that, and the song name, that goes to radio stations. Then you've got your 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit WAV file for CDs. Then you've got your vinyl mastering as well. So you have some mastering engineers will print and press vinyl. So a mastering engineer will do all that and make sure that you have all the formats that you need in the modern day for whatever you need. Cassette tapes, even. Mastering engineers will do that as well if you ask for it. So it's taking your music and getting it ready for distribution to the world. It's the last point in the creative process before you actually take the product and sell it. Or in the case of today, give it away on a streaming platform. So that's kind of the whole thing in a giant hour and 20-minute nutshell. Well, mixing and mastering anyway. If anyone has any questions or wants to see a more in-depth mix breakdown, let us know. We can do that out with the podcast if we get enough people saying do it. I can do like a YouTube walkthrough of a mix, explaining each component and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
If I don't get any replies, then I'll not do it.
Break out OBS and set it all up.
Yeah, you bet. Good old screen capture. Yeah. So, as always, if you enjoy the wee podcast that we do, give us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts and wherever you happen to listen to it, if it's Google or whatever. And share with your pals. And by share, I mean just tell them that it exists. You can share it on social media if you want, but just telling people that this is a thing really helps. There's a friend you have who plays drums and wants to start a band and maybe needs some advice. Just put them onto the podcast. That's what it's here for.
Yeah, man, totally.
So, I have no idea what's on the agenda next. I kind of want to do another band, another what do you call it? You know, the analysis of the ups and downs of bands.
That'd be fun.
Yeah, I need to think of one we can do, because we did the one last week on
Jefferson Airplane.
Yeah, most bizarre band ever.
Yes. Like, cool band. I like the music, but it just had a really interesting. It was good because it kind of basically pinpointed everything we've talked about.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's just like everything that you could do wrong, they kind of did.
Yeah.
Wrong. You know. So
maybe think of something.
As well as lots of really interesting things that they did right, because they obviously got successful for a reason. So. Yeah. That'll be interesting.
Cool. So we'll wrap it up there. Hope you've all had a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Right. Bye.